The Japanese word Nintendo is said to loosely translate to "leave the luck to heaven" in English, but that's exactly what the company didn't do with their line of outstanding home consoles. Nintendo made their own luck and became one of the greatest video game companies in the world, but it wasn't always smooth sailing for them. From Nintendo's humble beginnings in Japan to their worldwide success, if you want to know how they got to the top of the gaming mountain, the story starts all the way back in the year 1977. While everyone points to 1983 as the time where Nintendo finally entered the video game market, they actually did so much sooner. In fact, it was in 1977, during the first generation of video game consoles, where we'd see them release their first home console. Known as the Color TV game, this series of 5 consoles was released solely in Japan, where they would be plugged into your TV and used as a controller for a small amount of games. The controller didn't include Nintendo's patented D-pad though. It had a unique turntable dials like a radio. They were made in partnership with Mitsubishi, and the few games you could play on the console were Pong, hockey, volleyball, and tennis, among others, depending on the console you owned. The first console was known as the Color TV Game 6 because it could play 6 games. The Color TV game was the best-selling line of consoles in the first generation of video game consoles and really put Nintendo on the map, well, at least in Japan. After the success of the Color TV game, Nintendo decided they wanted to make a cartridge-based console called the Famicom, which was short for Family Computer, and released it exclusively in Japan in 1983. It was initially planned to be a 16-bit system, but due to budget constraints, it turned out to be 8-bit, and was the first console to include Nintendo's patented D-pad controller. And believe it or not, the launch of the Famicom was real bad. It came with 3 games, Donkey Kong, Donkey Kong Jr., and Popeye, and had a really bad chipset which forced plenty of the consoles to get recalled. Once it was reissued with a new motherboard, sales of the Famicom absolutely soared, which led to Nintendo making plans to expand to markets outside of Japan. The thing is, in North America, around the time of the success of the Famicom in Japan, we were dealing with the video game crash of 1983, which uncoincidentally ended the same year the Nintendo Entertainment System was released in 1985. Seeing how saturated the video game market was in North America due to so many options and a growing interest in personal computers at the time, Nintendo took a huge risk by expanding into a market where their competitors were all going bankrupt, but as you know, it all worked out in the end. The Famicom was released in the United States as the Nintendo Entertainment System, starting at the high price of $299. While this was a lot of money back then, it didn't slow down sales at all. The NES is actually credited for pulling the North American video game industry out of its 2-year crash, since it sold over 61.9 million units and was the best-selling console of the 3rd generation. It came with a unique box style and a zero-insertion force cartridge slot with a flip door, which made it feel like you were loading a video cassette and not a console. The only issue was that the pins from the connector would get bent after thousands and thousands of uses. It would also get very dusty in there, which made it difficult for some games to boot up. While blowing into the cartridges was a thing we all used to do, it actually made things worse because your saliva that actually made its way into the cartridge would slowly damage those copper connectors. The two-tone gray and black color scheme was a great touch with those red accents, and the classic Nintendo D-pad controller from Japan also made its way to the United States. The console competed with the Atari 7800 and the Sega Master System, and it came out on top. The console introduced us to classic games that'll forever be a part of video game history. Super Mario Bros., The Legend of Zelda, Metroid, Mega Man, Castlevania, and Final Fantasy, just to name a few. All of these games were the first to really start their respective franchises that are all still going strong today. 30 years later and counting, with the limited technology at the time, side-scrollers and overhead perspective games were the most popular ones, and these classics didn't disappoint, that's for sure. The NES in the United States got a sleek redesign in 1993 that was also released in Japan a month and a half later. The NES 101, which the new version was called, was more compact and featured a top-loading cartridge slot. The rounded dogbone-style controller made it easier to hold, and it was only $50, which sounds like a steal, but it was released 2 years after the Super Nintendo. Many gamers already jumped ship at that point, but if you couldn't get your hands on an SNES for whatever reason, then the NES 101 was the perfect cheap alternative at the time. In the technological realm, companies are always innovating and looking for ways to improve their product, and this was no different for Nintendo. After the success of the NES all around the world, it makes sense that they started working on their next project. While the Sega Genesis and TurboGrafx 16 both launched with 16-bit architecture, Nintendo knew they had to follow suit if they wanted to be successful in the current market. While the Sega Genesis claimed to have the fastest and strongest 16-bit architecture on the market, there was no way to prove it, and Nintendo honestly really didn't care about all the silly games Sega's marketing team was playing. 1991. The Super Nintendo era began with the Super Famicom that was released in Japan in 1990. The Super Famicom is still one of the nicest looking consoles ever made. It's compact, it has some nice rounded curves, and one of the greatest controllers of all time. The model also found its way to Europe and Australia in 1992, meaning they probably wouldn't even recognize the North American version of the Super Famicom. The Super Famicom was released as the Super Nintendo Entertainment System in North America in 1991. It looked absolutely nothing like its Japanese counterpart, which is a real shame. The SNES has a sliding power and reset buttons, which made it feel like a toy, along with a much-needed cartridge eject button. Also, depending on the North American version you got, the SNES had a tendency to turn yellow over time, while the purple accents remained in good shape, which made it look a little off. It's nostalgic to look at today, but wasn't quite right back then. The 16-bit system was a massive success in North America, but it surprisingly didn't sell as well as the NES worldwide. It sold incredibly well in Europe though, but that's mainly just because the NES wasn't widely accessible there. The specs of the console were the same as the Super Famicom, with the processor being powerful enough to handle Nintendo's famous Mode 7 graphics, which allowed the background of games to rotate while everything else remained in place. Despite the worldwide sales taking a dip compared to the NES, the SNES still ended up as the best-selling console of the 4th generation with over 49.1 million units sold. The rounded controller of the Super Famicom and the shoulder buttons are also found on the SNES controller, so there aren't many differences between the North American and Japanese versions other than the way they look. It's also important to keep in mind that the SNES wasn't backwards compatible with NES games, although adapters like the Super 8 came out that could make this possible. Just like with the NES, Nintendo released a slim and compact version of the Super Nintendo, known as the SNS 101, in North America in 1997 and later in Japan in 1998. It was a cute console with a reset button and a power switch, which made it feel less like a toy and more like an actual console. The controller was the same, just whiter, and the whole package cost about $100, which made it a very good entry-level system for those who couldn't dish out $200 for the Nintendo 64, but we'll get more into that soon. The Super Nintendo brought us so many great games, it's hard to list just a few, but we'll do our best. Super Mario World, The Legend of Zelda, A Link to the Past, Super Metroid, Donkey Kong Country, Star Fox, F-Zero, Final Fantasy VI, Earthbound, Mega Man X, Street Fighter II, Chrono Trigger, Mario Kart, and Super Mario RPG. The SNES blew the TurboGrafx 16 out of the water and began a rivalry with Sega that would be really one-sided and last only 3 generations. Only a rare few can compete with Nintendo in the video game market, and when Sony entered the fray by releasing the original 32-bit PlayStation console in Japan in 1994 and worldwide in 1995, Nintendo knew it had to improve on the SNES or they risked losing their market dominance over their competitors. Nintendo was also dealing with third-party developers growing frustrated over their strict licensing policies, so their next console was going to need to be great. Technology was getting even more advanced than ever before in the mid-90s. Nintendo's Mode 7 graphics just simulated 3D, but they started working on actual 3D polygon graphics that would later become the staple of the 5th generation of video game consoles. This led to the development of the Nintendo 64, which was codenamed Project Reality. The console was pretty much finished by mid-1995, but Nintendo wanted to make sure everything was A-OK before they finally released the console worldwide in 1996. The console sold for $199.99 and was facing stiff competition from not only the Sony PlayStation, but the Sega Saturn. The Sega Saturn only sold 9 million units worldwide, but the Sony PlayStation absolutely dominated 5th generation console sales with 102 million sales worldwide. Just to put things into perspective, that's nearly as much as the NES and SNES sales combined. Due to the presence of the PlayStation, the N64 didn't perform as well as the SNES, but still sold 32.93 million units around the world. The console debuted in a dark gray chassis, with an on-off switch and a reset button just like the SNS 101. To try and one-up the PlayStation's 32-bit processor, Nintendo decided to make the N64 carry a 64-bit processor, hence the name of the console. There was even a slot on the console for an expansion pack that would double the memory of the N64 from 4 megabytes to 8 megabytes. There weren't many games that needed it, but most of the relevant ones that did were Legend of Zelda, Majora's Mask, and Donkey Kong 64. Like we mentioned before, the 5th generation of video game consoles were known for their 3D polygon graphics, and all of this computing power in the N64 made for some great games, like Super Mario 64, The Legend of Zelda, or Ocarina of Time, which is, in our opinion, one of the greatest games of all time. Nintendo is still releasing games in cartridge format for the N64, despite the PlayStation using CDs that had more storage. How big was this storage difference, you ask? Well, the largest N64 cartridge was 64 megabytes, and Sony CD-ROMs had 650 megabytes of storage. Yeah, That means the games on the PlayStation could be 10 times larger than Nintendo 64 games. Nintendo's reluctance to switch to CDs mainly stems from their falling out with Sony. Now, this is legendary. Initially, Nintendo and Sony were working together to create the Nintendo PlayStation, but couldn't agree on using CDs or cartridges, which led to the project being cancelled. Sony ended up doing their own thing, led to the creation of the PlayStation, and Nintendo ended up making the N64. There's definitely much more to it than that, but we could have a whole documentary video on the Nintendo PlayStation if we wanted. In the end, the decision to start with cartridges really held the N64 back and caused loyal AAA developers to jump ship because the PlayStation console was better able to support their game. The most famous example of this was Square Enix with Final Fantasy VII, which required a lot of storage space to house full motion video. Well, at least cartridges were good for two things: non-existent load times and being more sturdy than a CD. The controller for the N64 was much different than the SNES controller. It was a unique three-prong design, where the leftmost prong had a D-pad and the middle one featured an analog stick, the first one ever created by Nintendo. It wasn't the easiest controller to hold, but it was a step in the right direction. The controller even supported haptic feedback, with the Rumble Pack add-on that debuted with Star Fox 64. The Nintendo 64 was one of the first consoles to support more than two players without the use of an adapter, which turned it into a party machine due to games like Super Smash Bros., Mario Party, Mario Kart, and GoldenEye 007. While the N64 wasn't the best-selling fifth-generation console of all time, it was a legendary console. Nintendo knew that they'd have to drop the use of cartridges for their sixth-generation console. It was holding them back, and if they really wanted to re-establish themselves as the top dog in the video game industry, they knew something had to change. In 1998, Sega would release the Dreamcast, followed by the Sony PlayStation 2 in 2000, and in 2001, it was Microsoft's first foray into the video game market with the Xbox. Nintendo released the Nintendo GameCube just 3 days after the Xbox in North America, and you could say Microsoft stole Nintendo's thunder because the Xbox ended up outselling the GameCube by 1 million units. The 22 million units the GameCube sold weren't too shabby though, even if it was less than the Nintendo 64 that came before it and dwarfed by the PS2's 153.6 million units sold. If you can tell, there was stiff competition for Nintendo in the sixth generation of consoles. Although it's called a GameCube, the console wasn't actually a true cube. It was released in black or indigo color, but was later released with a bunch of different colors, including a nice orange. The GameCube came with a handle on the back and honestly looked a lot like a toy, just like the Super Nintendo did. The system was much improved from the Nintendo 64, as it delivered 1.9G flops of power and got rid of the 3D polygon graphics, replacing them with more sharp, cartoonish graphics that have been a part of Nintendo consoles ever since. While the Xbox had an internal hard drive, the GameCube still required memory cards for storage. Another huge step forward for Nintendo was the use of optical discs as opposed to cartridges. Now, these weren't your typical CDs, they were small ones, known as game discs, made in partnership with Panasonic. They could hold up to 1.5 gigabytes of data as opposed to the 8.5 gigabytes of space on typical DVDs, and the only reason Nintendo used these game discs was due to the concerns regarding piracy. The limited storage size on the game discs weren't an issue for developers, but some ports were noticeably worse on the GameCube. The Nintendo GameCube controller was arguably the best one ever made, and we're not even exaggerating. It was a two-prong design, which is great seeing as we only have two hands, and it had a unique face buttons that were easy to press, along with a Z button right near the right trigger instead of behind the controller. They all had built-in rumble except the Wavebird controller, which traded it for wireless functionality. The GameCube controller is still the best option for Super Smash Bros. Today. In regards to the games on the system, there were some classics including Super Mario Sunshine, Super Smash Bros. Melee, The Legend of Zelda The Wind Waker, Metroid Prime, and Paper Mario The Thousand Year Door, among many others. Now that Nintendo wasn't just second but third in the console wars, they had to shake things up even more. Despite moving from cartridges to optical discs and improving the graphics tremendously, it still wasn't enough to put the GameCube on top, so Nintendo had to go back to the drawing board once again. With Sega now out of the picture after the failure of the Dreamcast and the Saturn before it, it became a three-horse race between Nintendo, Sony, and Microsoft. Nintendo was never going to make a console that's competitive with their rivals in terms of pure power, so they decided to focus on motion controls for the next console. After all, Shigeru Miyamoto always said power wasn't everything in terms of consoles. They worked on this new form of player engagement, which led to the Nintendo Wii. The Wii was the final 7th generation console to be released in 2006, just 8 days after the PS3, and over a year after the release release of the Xbox 360. While those consoles were much more powerful than the Wii and had far superior graphical capabilities, the great marketing and incredible motion controls of the Wii made it a worldwide powerhouse. The Wii sold 101.63 million units worldwide, which not only ended Nintendo console decline, but turned it into their best-selling console to date. Using Bluetooth and infrared detection sensors, the Wii Remote, or Wiimote as we like to call it, was able to detect movement in 3 dimensions. The Wiimote came with a D-pad, speaker, and a few face buttons and a trigger, with a nunchuck that could be plugged into the remote to add a control stick and 2 more analog triggers. Wii Sports, which was bundled with the console, couldn't have been a better showcase of the Wii's capabilities, and it's still so much fun to play today. While the Wii finally got regular-sized discs, its main downside was that it wasn't able to play games in HD, like the PS3 or Xbox 360. It was stuck at 480p, but as we've mentioned, that didn't affect its sales. It was also Nintendo's first console to support backwards compatibility, being able to play GameCube games due to having a hidden port at the top for GameCube controllers and memory cards. Another huge innovation with the Wii was the inclusion of online play. It was light years behind the PlayStation Network and Xbox Live, being chock full of issues and tremendous lag, but it did give us the Virtual Console, which allowed us to download emulated games from past Nintendo consoles. Along with the Virtual Console and Wii Sports, you had hit games such as Super Mario Galaxy, Mario Kart Wii, Super Smash Bros. Brawl, Metroid Prime 3 Corruption, The Legend of Zelda Twilight Princess, and Skyward Sword. The Wii truly was an entertainment center. With the Wii, Nintendo appealed to a more casual audience. They pretty much left Sony and Microsoft on an island fighting for the most powerful console, while they were just raking in the dough. It was a great business strategy in the end. In 2012, Nintendo released the Wii Mini, which, as you can see, was quite tiny and had a top-loading optical drive. At only $100, it was essentially a dumbed-down version of the console that could only play games. It couldn't connect to the internet or play GameCube games. Also in 2012, Nintendo released their most forgettable console, other than the Virtual Boy of course, the Wii U. Trying to piggyback on the success of the Wii, the 8th generation console had a terrible launch due to a bad marketing campaign that focused too much on their younger audience and a confusing name. People thought it was just an add-on to the Wii, which led to the console only selling 13.3 million units, making it Nintendo's lowest selling major console to date. But now that we got all the bad out, let's talk about what's good about the Wii U. While it wasn't a graphical powerhouse, it was Nintendo's first system to support 1080p, which was a huge step. It also came with 8 to 32 gigabytes of storage depending on the model you got. It was even backwards compatible with the Wii, but not with the GameCube. Arguably, the most significant feature of the Wii U was the gamepad. It was a tablet-like controller which featured a 6.2-inch touchscreen, along with dual analog sticks, a D-pad, and multiple face buttons. It even supported motion controls, haptic feedback, and near-field communication, which allowed you to sync your amiibo figures to the console. The Wii U launched with the game Nintendo Land, which helped showcase the mechanics of the gamepad, similar to what Nintendo did with Wii Sports, showcasing the Wii's mechanics. On top of all this, the gamepad could even be used as a second screen for multiplayer games to avoid screen peeking. The gamepad was interesting, but clearly not interesting enough. That being said, the Wii U did have its fair share of great games. Mario Kart 8, Super Smash Bros. 4, Splatoon, and Super Mario Maker were all incredible games in their own right, but they still weren't enough to entice more gamers to buying the console. The Wii was a peak, but the Wii U was a valley, yet it was nothing Nintendo couldn't rebound from. Luckily, Nintendo was smart enough to realize what their major mistake with the Wii U was. While the gamepad was inventive, it just didn't push the envelope enough. You weren't able to carry it around and play Wii U games anywhere you go, which really made it more of a gimmicky accessory than anything else. There are companion apps that you can download on your phone for PS4 and Xbox One games nowadays that can pretty much do everything the gamepad did for Wii U games. All of this is what made Nintendo decide to keep what made the Wii U interesting, remove all the clutter, and come up with a brand new, truly hybrid console. Released in 2017, it's hard to believe the Nintendo Switch has already been with us for over a year. Just like the Wii, the Switch was a big change for Nintendo, and so far, the gamble has paid off. Again, the Switch isn't nearly as powerful as the PlayStation 4 and Xbox One, but it does what Nintendo wants it to do. The system can be played on TVs at home using the dock, and can be removed from the dock and played like a handheld console on the go. The Switch uses a 6.2-inch 720p screen, and while docked, the image can be displayed in 1080p on TVs, but it doesn't have 4K compatibility yet. Maybe once they make the Switch Pro or something, Nintendo will add it on in there. The quality of the screen is so much better than the Wii U's gamepad, especially for extended gaming sessions. Speaking of extended gaming sessions, the lithium-ion battery in the Switch is big enough to offer you at least 3 hours of consistent play. Some games will give you much more than 3 hours though. The Switch comes with 32 gigabytes of internal storage, which isn't great at all, but it also has a micro SD slot that could expand its storage by up to 2 terabytes, even though those don't exist yet and probably will cost you a small fortune. You could find a pretty cheap 128 or 200GB micro SD card out there, and that's what we recommend for the Switch. The console itself isn't the only thing that's hybrid about the Switch, so are the controllers. Sure, you could buy a Pro controller, but the Joy-Cons that come with the controller can be used in a bunch of different ways. You could hold a single one horizontally and attach the wrist strap on it to make it a controller, or you could hold one in each hand freeform, or you could even attach them both to a grip and play it like a regular controller. There's so many different ways to play on the Switch. The Nintendo Switch had a massive success compared to the Wii U, selling over 22 million units and counting, which is already more than its predecessor. With games like The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, Super Mario Odyssey, and Super Smash Bros. Ultimate, the Switch has an incredible library of games that can only get better. Shigeru Miyamoto's ultimate goal is for the Switch to not only be owned by every family, but every single person. While it's a lofty goal, it's one we wouldn't put past Nintendo. And that was the evolution of Nintendo consoles. They've come a long way since the color TV game. What's your favorite Nintendo console? Do you still have a working NES? Let us know in the comment section below, and don't forget to subscribe to The Gamer for more documentary videos like this one. Thanks for watching.